Welcome to the Wake Up Protocol. I am your host, Nadja Haldimann, and together we're having life-changing conversations with real people about spiritual awakening and the transformations that follow. We're mapping the messy path of awakening so you can go further faster and feel a little less alone along the way. For this episode of the Wake Up Protocol, I'm joined by McKenna, a licensed psychotherapist, trauma and eating disorder specialist, and integration guide who's been walking beside her clients on their healing journeys. Katie's work bridges psychology and spirituality in a way that feels deeply grounded. Through her practice, she helps people reconnect to their wholeness, integrating the light and shadow, the mind and body, the human and the divine. In this conversation, we explore what it really means to integrate after awakening, how to stay connected to the wisdom that arises in peak experiences, how to bring it back into daily life, and how to honor the parts of ourselves that are still catching up to the expansion. We talk about intuition, embodiment, and the difference between fear and inner knowing. We look at what happens when we change faster than the people around us and how to find belonging beyond the patterns we outgrow. Katie reminds us that healing isn't about transcending our humanity. It's about weaving every part of ourselves into a fuller, truer expression of who we already are. This conversation is a reminder that awakening is not about becoming somebody new. It's about remembering the wholeness that's been within you all along.
To me, spiritual awakening is tied to starting to question the way I was taught the world was supposed to be. And growing up in a Catholic school in the Midwest, things were pretty much dictated what to expect out of life. And so to me, awakening spiritually was about starting to realize and question some of these things I was taught about, like, do we really have to get married with a picket fence in order to find happiness? And so that ability to start to question what I was taught is what then allowed me to start seeking out other ways of being, whether or not it was through counterculture and like loving like the Grateful Dead and just seeing like, oh, there's a lot of different cultures and ways that people live their lives. So yeah, spiritual awakening for me started when I started questioning things.
McKenna, welcome to the Wake Up Protocol.
Hello, thank you for having me.
I'm really excited to have this conversation with you today. And for our listeners, I want to share that you are actually the partner, the wife of Titus Kahutek, who was on episode 4. And actually our most popular episode so far. And you are the other part of all that magic that he was sharing. And I'm just really excited and curious to hear what your perspective is, sort of balancing out the masculine and the feminine of that story that he started a few weeks ago.
Oh yeah.
And I know one of the things that we talked about earlier is integration, because we all do this work and then we might or might not have spiritual awakenings. They might be faster, they might be slower for different people. But if we just do the work and we don't actually integrate any of that work, we might not necessarily get anywhere with it. It might not necessarily stick. And so you are a psychotherapist, and maybe you want to tell a little bit more about exactly what your role is and your profession is and how you work with people, and then get into how you see integration.
Sure. Well, there's a lot that could be said there. So the easy part is that I'm a licensed mental health therapist, and I have been practicing since 2009. And typically my work is seeing individuals one-on-one through 60-minute sessions. And I often work with people for sometimes as short as 3 or 6 months, but sometimes even 5 or 7 years, just depending on what's going on with them.
Oh, wow.
And through my work as a mental health therapist, I do focus on eating disorders, anxiety, and trauma. And a lot of the trauma work and the anxiety work's about actually the somatic part, about like what's going on in our bodies. So that's one thing where Titus and I can have a lot of overlap in what we get to talk about and share. But when you came to me with this idea about your podcast and the work around awakenings, the integration part was really what I knew I could talk about so much, because to me, that's the part that matters so much. We can find sometimes these opportunities that can be big and bright and truly like an awakening that's a pinpoint moment. But if we don't know how to weave it into our everyday life, we can lose our grasp with it and it kind of float away like a dream. And so I believe that integration is just essential for healing in all the different ways.
Hmm. I'm really curious how you see integration in terms of some of the epiphanies that people are having as they're going through these spiritual awakenings.
Sure. I had a mentor, or still have a mentor. Her name's Shar Sundust, who I have worked with since 2007. And she was one of the people that helped me understand that these kinds of spiritual awakenings we have, whether or not it's through a health crisis or something to do with psychedelics or just like a life milestone, that often it's like the work that we do afterwards where we really get the lessons from them. And so to me, integration is to be able to continue to have like a touchstone back to those moments of what we're calling awakening, and then to continue to harvest from that. What was my learning? What did I think my learning was? What does my learning continue to be? Because it can also change over time.
Hmm. Hmm.
And sometimes what we get in those moments, there can be so much there to unpack, and it takes a while. And so that integration is an opportunity to really ground it and make it real so that it's not just something fleeting and passing.
Hmm. And is that something that you specifically work with people in your practice to help them integrate things?
You know, integration is the essence of how people find a lot of healing. And this is maybe a little bit moving away from the idea of an awakening, but I think a lot of mental health work is about integration of the wholeness of who we are. You know,
Hmm.
sometimes we can have a very fractured sense of self, especially if we have ideas of like, this part of me is good and this part of me is bad, or this part of me is accepted and this part of me is my shadows. And that divides us. And so when we can start to integrate the self, meaning all the personality traits, the strengths and the weaknesses, the light and the shadow, like that move towards wholeness, I think is actually the essence of mental health work.
Mm.
So yeah, I do a lot of that integration.
That's really beautiful how you're explaining that. And it makes a lot of sense to me because we are so many different parts. I mean, we're consciousness orchestrating all these beings that eventually make us. And ultimately, we're
Right.
just void. We're just mostly vacuum. We're mostly nothingness, right? And here are all these beings, our gut biome, and all the things that we're orchestrating and trying to create harmony around all of that. And so being
Right.
able to integrate all the parts on the body, the mind, the spiritual, and the emotional part is ultimately what makes us whole and, in a
Mhm.
sense, awake, because now we can become authentic, present, and free in who we truly are in this lifetime, in this incarnation.
Yeah, exactly. Well said.
So you're doing that work with the body as a
Yeah.
whole. But then when I think of the spiritual awakenings, my previous husband, he said to me, "You have changed." And I said, "Yes, I have."
Mhm.
And that was the end of our relationship because I
Mhm.
changed. And so we do change, but then it's like, how do we change and start incorporating all of that? So I'm curious how we can start consolidating who we used to be, maybe what we want to
Right.
let go of, what the new version is, and how to start integrating, consolidating that to become an even better version of ourselves.
Yeah. Well, you know, I think so much of it actually can be aided when we're proactive. Like when we know we're entering into a period of change or healing or searching for new ways of being, when we understand that one of the steps is integration, I think that right there starts to help us have space for that. Well, this is going to sound like a tangent, but I just got back from Missouri helping my mom. She had a total knee replacement. So the doctors came in and gave her a new knee, but now
Hmm.
all of the real work for her is actually helping the rest of that leg in the brain even learn how to use the knee, like
Mm.
integration. And so sometimes we can have new experiences or a new knee, but in order for that to actually serve our life and serve our destiny, we need to be able to rewire how to use that. And The knee is an interesting example because it's so tangible. But
Mm-hmm.
really, I think what you're talking about is like the different parts of our psyche that sometimes we just grow and evolve and old parts kind of fall away. Just like
Mm-hmm.
right now we're in fall and, the leaves fall or we kind of prune things back. That's natural. Sometimes old parts go a little dormant and then they reawaken and then can integrate later in life. It feels to me like sometimes our psyche is a bit of a recipe where, each decade something different can come forward and sometimes old parts return. And you do bring up an interesting point, though, that sometimes the people in our lives, it doesn't suit them to stay with the people that we become. And that's not an easy thing. There's some sacrifice there as far as for you in that example of being willing to let yourself evolve and knowing that that meant then you were also going to be saying goodbye to different things of like what you knew to be true about your life.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, it feels like that happens often when we change, that certain things will have to fall away. It's to
Hmm.
maybe even make room for certain new things. And
Right.
because it's a choice we all get to make ourselves, is if we want to change, if this is something we're willing to do. And I mean, specifically on this podcast, I'm interviewing a lot of people about their spiritual awakening.
Hmm.
And for most of them, things fall away. And so
Hmm.
I'm also curious how you see the concept of staying and being happy with where we are
Sure.
versus staying and numbing because we're just not willing to change.
Yeah, and that can take a long time for each individual to be able to tell what's needed for them because I think it's all kind of got a time and a place. Like there's a certain time where if you're feeling a call for something new, and yet you might want to examine the power of being content or practicing your gratitude or not being caught in that idea of the grass is always greener, like the impulse to move. So those things
Yeah,
can all
that's a
be
big
true.
one.
Those things can all be true, and yet it can also be true that it is time for things to change and to die. I mean, that's the nuance of how complex our lives are and all of us as individuals is all these different things like your medicine for right now, which might be to leave and start new. Later on, your medicine might be to stay content and bloom where you're planted. So it's not a one size fits all piece. It really depends on the individual and where they're at in their time in life. And honestly, I do believe that that is where the power of our intuition and or if it applies to somebody their like faith or philosophy about like the world and the universe is how they start to make sense of that inner guidance.
Yeah. I really like how you said that sometimes, I don't know if that's exactly the words you said, but what I'm hearing is that sometimes we evolve by
Hmm.
actually staying and deepening. It doesn't always have to be the new, the next. I almost see like a tree. On one hand, it
Yeah.
grows up and it makes all the leaves and it also sheds them, right, in each season, but then it's also the roots and they're there. And that's like the element of earth. And
Hmm.
that's the steadiness. And it's like what needs to stay in order for the rest to grow and evolve. So it's a healthy organism.
Yeah, right. Well, this might be taking us in a different direction, and we can bring it back to spiritual awakenings. But sometimes people can be unhappy in a relationship and wondering, like, do I need a new partner? Or yet, am I supposed to stay? And sometimes there's this idea the lessons might be the same, like that the individual's still learning, let's say, communication skills or being vulnerable or being loved. And if
Mhm.
you just cycle through a different human being on the other side of that, your lessons are still the same. And so if we're kind of dropping a relationship as soon as it gets hard or if it's challenging, then we might not actually be really facing the work that we're supposed to do of staying in the relationship.
And then people just repeat the same cycle over and over again and basically get in the same relationship with just with a different person.
Right, right.
Hmm. So when you think about intuition in this
Mhm.
context, how does that come in place?
I think that intuition I define that differently from psychic work, but to me, intuition is that ability to really hear your deepest wisdom, to be able to hear really subtle nuances of what's right for you and what your next steps are. And people say, like, my gut instinct or that kind of
Mhm.
thing. Usually there's a little bit of a physical sensation that goes with that guidance. But because nobody's ever going to be able to tell you what path to take or who to stay with or where to seek your healing or your awakenings, you might be able to research a lot of ideas in today's world. And there's often like more than one right thing out there, but to really attune to these little nuances of like, oh, but this specific route or path is what's right for me and aligns with my values and my destiny. I think intuition is how we get that specific.
And how do you think we can access that intuition? You said a gut feeling.
Mhm. Um, well, it's actually a really fascinating process because my belief is that the intuition, the wisdom's there. If we're not hearing it, it's because there's actually something in the way. And so
Mm,
it's not necessarily that you have to create your higher being or your deeper self. It's more that you have ask this question of like, what might be blocking my ability to hear it? And so some obvious things might be a strong inner critic, often can be a very loud thing that gets in the way of hearing soft whispers of intuition, like poor self-esteem. Honestly, being like stuck or over busy in our heads or over busy in our lives also can just drown out often what's soft, subtle guidance. And
mm-hmm.
then the other piece that can come up a lot too is that people who carry a lot of stress or anxiety can feel a lot in their bodies. And
Yeah.
so it's a big question how to distinguish the sensation of fear or anxiety from intuition. Because
Mm.
both feelings can kind of travel in the body and the belly and the heart and the chest. And so that can be murky trying to sort that out in the beginning.
Yeah, so there's so many distractions on how
Mm-hmm.
we might not have access to our intuition. We might be too
Mm-hmm.
busy, we might carry anxiety, we might maybe even feel bad in our bodies in other ways, so
Sure.
that it takes that attention for medical reasons, physical illnesses.
Mm-hmm.
And the anxiety thing, there's obviously a lot of anxiety in people's bodies these days
Yeah.
with everything that's happening in the world. What are some practices that people could do to start dropping more into intuition and start fine-tuning the antenna that picks up on the signal of the intuition in the body so they can actually start following their own inner guidance?
Mm-hmm. One of the things that I find helpful as a first step is starting to understand that fear usually is a sensation of some kind of constriction. And
Mm,
intuition almost never comes with tightness. And so that's like a beginning way to start to say yes or no. Was it, did I get tight when I had this thought or feeling or not? One of my other teachers gives an example of it that intuition doesn't say, oh, don't go down that alley, something bad will happen. Intuition's more of like, oh, you know what? I need to get a second cup of tea, so I'm not going to leave my house just yet. It doesn't talk to us through those messages of fear.
mm.
Um, Even though it's easier said than done, keeping it simple like that, like did it come with constriction? I think that's a really good beginning.
I love that. Yeah, that does it feel expansive or does it feel contracting? And if it feels contracting, then maybe that's not intuition. Maybe that's programming, that's fear, that's something else. So basically, what I'm hearing from you is that
Hmm.
intuition talks in a more expansive, more positive, more open way. And it wants to guide us to a place of love and peace and togetherness and the higher frequencies versus
Hmm.
the lower frequencies. And that actually brings up an interesting thought in me that we're always manifesting. We're default manifesting, whether we have a positive or negative thought. The
Hmm.
universe is like, oh, you want that? Choose your own adventure. We're going to give you exactly what you want. And so if it feels
Yeah.
expansive, we manifest what we want. And usually people say, oh, I manifested that. They very rarely say I manifested a negative thing. They usually say I manifested a positive thing.
Hmm.
So maybe using that intuition and going like, I manifested the positive thing because I listened to my intuition because there was a positive feeling inside of my body. And now
Yeah.
I'm putting that out there versus the default manifesting of I'm having a negative emotion, I'm sending out a signal, and magnetically it starts attracting to me. And now that's landing in my reality.
Right. Right. Our brains, not our psyche and our bigger being, but literally the organ of the brain essentially wants us to be right. So if you think I'm going to have a bad day or I'm not a good person, that you'll tend to get those experiences. And again, those are contractive ways that we do manifest and then repeat our realities. And this is where we start to weave in the integration part, because let's say somebody has an experience, a spiritual awakening, where they have a sense of self that is full of love for the self. Sometimes that's like one of the things I hear the most from people is they have a moment where they actually love themselves.
Hmm.
You can imagine how powerful that experience is. But then, if a few days start to pass or time starts to pass, then the pattern of negative self-talk or just the patterns of stress in life will start to want to like pull you back into that old reality. And so the integration is about how do you practice returning to that felt sense of self-love? How do you build the muscle? So you had the experience, but now we have to either build the muscle or build the path so that that becomes the new normal.
And I'm so glad you're mentioning self-love. To me, that's the foundation of everything. And I actually just had a really interesting conversation with a couple of my girlfriends, two women who are married with each other, and I love them dearly and they're amazing. And I had a realization not long ago about my own homophobia with myself.
Hmm.
I identify as not gay, and therefore I am not allowed to love a woman in a way that is like truly being in love with someone like I would be with a man, which actually hindered me from having a relationship of self love with myself.
Hmm.
I did a lot of work around that a few years ago. It wasn't projecting to others, it was just for myself. And I'd never had access to loving myself truly until I reframed that. And it's interesting what happened. All of a sudden, it's like, it doesn't matter who you love. It can be a man or a woman as long as it's somebody that you're in love with. And therefore, I now have permission to love myself. I have permission to be in love with a woman.
Mm-hmm.
And I
Mm-hmm.
wonder if that's something that other people are experiencing too. And that might be part of the reason why they are not fully able to love themselves because we're of our own gender.
Yeah, honestly, I think there's so many different reasons that we struggle to love ourselves. Despite my quick speech I use professionally about like what do I do and the kind of people I serve, honestly, behind the scenes, if I were to just be really short, what I feel like I really do is help people with self-esteem
Mm,
across the board and anybody from all degrees of professional and success. The things on the outside are rarely telling of how somebody actually feels about themselves on the inside.
hmm.
So they have the struggle with self-worth and self-perception and deserving love. There's so much to be said there.
Yeah, thank you. Let's come back to the spiritual awakening here.
Hmm. Hmm.
And I would like to ask you if you would be open to defining what spiritual awakening means to you.
Sure. I like the opportunity too because sometimes I have so many things I talk about from the professional zone, but to allow this to be a personal reflection, um, to me, spiritual awakening is tied to starting to question the way I was taught the world was supposed to be.
Mm,
Growing up in a Catholic school in the Midwest, things were pretty much dictated what to expect out of life.
mm,
And so to me, awakening spiritually was about starting to realize and question some of these things I was taught about. Like, do we really have to get married with a picket fence in order to like find happiness? And so that ability to start to question what I was taught is what then allowed me to start seeking out other ways of being, whether or not it was through counterculture and like loving like the Grateful Dead and just seeing like, oh, there's a lot of different cultures and ways that people live their lives. So,
hmm.
yeah, spiritual awakening for me started when I started questioning things.
Yeah, that's interesting. Just questioning the reality, the programming that you grew up with.
Hmm. Hmm.
And what did that look like? What did you start questioning?
Well, I remember one thing was kind of simple. I was maybe 16 or something, and we were out camping, and there was some different people around the campfire, and somebody was passing around a joint, and I had never been around joints before cannabis, and they pass it, and I said no because I've been raised with the whole idea of the DARE program and drugs are bad and all this thing. But I walked back to my tent with my friend, and I was like, those people seem like normal people. They didn't seem like bad people. And so, like, that was kind of an example of I was taught that certain people are bad, like bad, evil, scary, dangerous criminals if you're doing certain things, in this case, smoking a joint. And I was like, well, that didn't really add up to my reality. Those people seemed, they were just like sitting around a campfire. But that was actually a pinpoint moment of realizing all these things I've been taught, maybe they weren't accurate.
That is so fascinating. I mean, we see that all the time, right? We have our beliefs and they get reinforced by people who think just like us. And we don't
Hmm.
actually know people who do the things that we think are bad
Right.
until we get to know them. And then all of a sudden it's like, oh, they're just people. And what I often hear is, well, that person, but that person is different. It's like, no, not
Um,
necessarily. And when we start holding curiosity to actually see how they're engaging in life, we realize, as you said, they're actually not bad people. And maybe the things they're doing is actually not bad either. It's just something we were told based on the people that program us want us to believe a certain way so that we can follow certain rules that potentially they could control us in ways that they otherwise can't. What's
right.
your thought on that?
I think you said it really well. There's a lot of dogma and doctrine that's passed down. And if we come from people who aren't also questioning, and by people I mean family, but let's also say teachers or doctors or religious figures that are meant to guide us, if everybody's
Hmm.
just repeating what they've been spoon fed, and people haven't stopped to actually think, wait, is this still good for us? Does this still apply? And so things just kind of stay in that very unconscious, unexplored paradigm until somebody decides to start to think differently or ask new questions.
Yeah.
Um, as we're talking, I'm remembering too something that happened that really impacted me when I was even younger. I was either 14 or 15, but I was exposed to the book The Celestine Prophecy. So I went to
Hmm.
a Catholic high school and we had to do book reports, and somebody had chosen the book Celestine Prophecy, which is one of the books in the mid 90s that was really starting to like give an example of what it really means that we create our own reality through our thoughts and our perceptions and our ability that if we don't like our reality, our ability to change that through the thought process. And so that book just blew my little 14-year-old mind
Hmm.
because I've never been exposed to different ways of thinking. I was
Hmm.
really just raised in this way of you're supposed to do what you're told, you're supposed to be a good little girl, and your life will be fine, which, I think now is an empty, unfulfilling promise. So, books are another way that I really found awakening.
Yeah, and you're not the only one who's sharing that. I had a couple of guests already on this podcast for whom a book was a big thing. One of
Mm.
them was a cancer survivor, but during his cancer journey, his mom gave him the book The Power of Now.
Ah,
And that really shifted something for him. And then I can't
mhm.
remember what the other book was, but he went traveling and ended up meeting some people somewhere in Europe, but he traveled all over the world and met some new people. And they gave him a book. And it was one of those spiritual books that
Mm.
really changed the way he thought about reality. And then he started questioning everything and exploring things in new ways and reconstructing his
Right.
reality and his own
Questioning everything.
questioning everything and
Yeah,
writing his own program that
right.
he's now living by.
Right. Well, and to me, the ability to become conscious of our mental process, that is a spiritual process for me.
Hmm.
That is the ability to understand maybe the machinery that these human bodies have. And in my own philosophy, understand the spirit or the soul gets to employ the machinery to use it to direct whatever path or fate we want to take. But until we have the ability to catch those mental automations, we're stuck in ruts and habits of how the brain tends to just repeat, repeat. So when we start to question things, including specifically our own thought processes, let's say questioning the thought that I don't deserve love, you start to question that, and that's what opens things up. And that hope feels very spiritual to me, even though I might be using a lot of mental health terminology.
Yeah. Questioning, holding curiosity, and then starting to explore from that place.
Yeah,
The more people I'm interviewing, the more two words start to emerge. Holding curiosity, or two concepts, and the other one is
Mhm.
becoming the observer.
Oh, sure. Yeah,
And
right.
so, how do you see the observer part in all of that?
I think the observer is a really useful word to me. Starting to understand that we can have a lot of internal conversations, or honestly, sometimes I almost think of them as like radio stations. And
Hmm.
it's the observer that witnesses all of it. And the way I think of it, the observer is then the one who also gets to be like the director, the composer. It's like, yes, many different pathways of thought or different pathways of possibility. But the observer slash the composer gets to say, I want to go that direction. Let's lean into
Mm-hmm.
this. And so it's the aspect of self that guides us. And I think that's what a lot of us want. We want to feel like we can take our life in the direction we want to go. Regardless of, let's say, a cancer diagnosis or a stressful day, all of these difficult things that happen to everybody, the observer can have some opportunity to bend it to the experience that we want. So we can't manifest necessarily our way out of never having stress. Being human seems to come with plenty of hardship for everybody,
Mm-hmm.
but the observer can choose how we handle the stress
Mm-hmm.
and how we navigate through the obstacles.
Yeah. So, how do you think people can start stepping into the observer part of themselves?
It seems that meditation is one of the best practices for that. And I do mean practice like going to the gym. To me, it's about building a muscle. Some people might meditate for stress reduction or relaxation. Meditating in order to become aware of that layer of the self that is the observer. Let's say you set an alarm for 5 minutes and you say, I'm just going to focus on my breath.
Mm-hmm.
So you give the brain a little bit of a job to stay present, focus on the breath. But the brain's naturally going to be like, oh, I forgot to do a task, or I need to think about the dry cleaning. And then you're like, oh, shoot, I forgot. Wait, back to the breath, back to the breath. And so the opportunity here is to be gentle with yourself because you're not faulting yourself for every time you get off track, every time you stop thinking about the breath, because it's the observer that kicks in, is like, hey, Katie, you're supposed to be thinking about your breath right now. And so the observer says, come back to the breath. And so every time you get off track in your meditation is when the observer starts to like have a
Mm-hmm.
little voice or a little guidance. And so then you start to pair and learn how to listen to that observer. And so sometimes there's a sensation there. So sometimes it's a felt experience of, oh, wait, yeah, I actually decided for 5 minutes I was going to breathe. And then you start to feel what it's like to have that witness going on, even when the brain gets a little off track. So,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I think 5 minutes of meditation a day or most days is a great way to get started.
And that's great. Just 5 minutes. Everybody has 5 minutes here or there. That's not a huge commitment. It's not a half an hour that you need to set aside. And
Right.
then just
Yeah.
getting those reps. When you were
Yeah.
explaining that, what came up for me was the monkey mind, which we all talk
Hmm.
about. But then really the monkey being the monkey versus teaching the monkey how to not always be doing the things that it might do without
Hmm.
actually thinking it through.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. Right.
Gosh, we have so many monkeys in ourselves.
It's true.
When I think about me, it's, uh, yeah, there's so much that just happens until we're like, okay, hold on a second. I'm just thinking about my relationship to social media. I was really good at it until I started this podcast, and now I have to be on it a lot more because I'm
Sure.
telling people about the new episodes, and all of a sudden I'm in the doom scrolling. I'm like, wow, this is unbelievably addictive. And what do I do?
Hmm.
So, what I do now is I always have post-it notes with me. And before I go into social media, I write my intention of why I wanted to use social media and what I wanted to
Ah,
do and a
right.
timestamp. And then I get lost in it. And then I have a physical artifact to come back to.
Hmm.
But
Hmm.
yeah, it's like, how do you train your monkey mind within the dopamine addictive social media screen world to make sense of all of that? That's like next level.
It is. Well, the thing is those things are so highly engineered to capture our attention. Just like a parallel is junk food. Junk food is like
Mm.
designed to capture us, to make us want to eat more, buy more. Neither
Hmm.
one of us is actually truly nourishing.
Hmm.
So, yeah, it is a lot of work that impacts us. And that's also where that compassion piece comes in, though, because of some of these things feel like uphill battles, and our job is to stay curious and compassionate and to do our best. But again, intuition then can start to pipe up and be like, oh, I feel bad after I've been scrolling for too
Hmm.
long. We have this inner compass that can help us.
Yeah, it's really checking in with ourselves.
Hmm.
Do I feel good or do I feel bad? And if I feel bad, that was probably not the right thing to do for an extended period of time.
Yeah, right.
So I know you've had some sort of a spiritual awakening path, but yours
Hmm.
was not a one and done pivotal moment. What did
Right.
that look like in your life?
Despite the difficulties and the traumas that I've had in my life, there's also been a lot of grace. And so my awakenings have all been gentle.
Mm-hmm.
and slow and steady. And so I do think books certainly for a long time meant a lot to me and kept me opening doors, um, questioning some of the dogma that I was raised with. And I mean that with all respect to my family. And then when I was younger, for a number of years, I had a pretty severe eating disorder. And sometimes when that happens, parents get really involved. But the last thing I wanted was my parents to get involved. And so I really sought out how to find healing through that.
Mm-hmm.
And not necessarily what I would recommend for anybody else because people deserve help in those kinds of journeys. But having a compulsion like an eating disorder that was so physical on one hand and mental, and then I had to find this way to continuously talk to myself to say this can't last forever, these behaviors are eventually going to cause a lot of harm.
Mm-hmm.
But a compulsion doesn't make any sense. It's a very hard thing. You can't just be smart about it, right? Because like smarts don't matter to irrational behaviors.
Mm-hmm.
And I had to really over time bring on board a really strong observer like we were just talking about before, to get really present and to very gently calm myself. Don't do that habit, don't do that compulsion, try to stay in this present moment without taking any action. I mean, I can credit that now to a lot of then just what became like such a solid connection to my observer self, which has now led to this part that I see spirit manifest in our world almost constantly. And I've sought out also teachers and mentors, some from Native American culture, some from psychic mediumship talents and abilities, and just this sought out community that reinforces the idea that there are larger forces at work than what we can measure and see right now on the human plane. And so when I'm surrounded by other people that do believe in things like that there's consciousness before and after death, and I get to have conversations with people about that in very grounded real world ways, not just philosophical what happens later in life, but how does that belief impact us now and how does that get to shape the way we live our worlds. So I think that's been why things have been slow and steady. Is then I also just since I was in my 20s started seeking out community
Mm-hmm.
of people that I felt drawn to and excited and inspired by. So it's been very helpful to have mentors as well.
Mm. Yeah, so what I'm hearing is you had a bit of a spiritual opening, maybe rather than awakening, through the
Yeah,
book
that's a
The
good word.
Celestine Prophecy first, because that
Mm-hmm.
made you question the way
Mm-hmm.
reality was and actually give you insight that there might be more to reality than what you thought, that we actually have more power to think things into existence and allow them to manifest in our lives.
Mm-hmm.
Does that
Yeah.
sound
Yeah.
right? And
Mm-hmm.
then the second one was with your eating disorder, where you actually had to confront your own demons and
Mm-hmm.
figure out how to get through and past that experience.
Right.
And were there more of those kinds of experiences?
There's many little ones. So as a young person, getting involved in counterculture, back then it was Grateful Dead and Fish, and going to
Mm,
music and dancing and seeing honestly so many people dance in such free-spirited ways was so eye-opening
yeah.
and permissive, like giving people permission to just be yourself, and so much friendliness in
Hmm.
those kinds of communities. That was very mind-opening and
Mm.
heart-opening.
I can
Mhm.
absolutely relate to the Grateful Dead experience. I had just moved from Switzerland to the United States. I went to art school there and I met some people through my school and
Mhm.
they took me to a Grateful Dead concert. And I had an idea of what America was like, but it was very different. It's what I saw from politics and from
Mm.
TV shows. Married
Mhm.
with Children was one of the TV shows I
Oh
saw,
God.
right? So I was like, yeah, I kind of have a bit of an idea what this is all about, but not
Mhm.
really. And then I got introduced to the Renaissance Fair,
Right.
Grateful Dead, and they also took me to a rave within a 1 month period. And at the time, a phone call was $1.80 a minute, so I couldn't really talk, but I could do a fax. And I was like, how do I capture what just happened, what I experienced in this completely new world,
Yeah.
and share that with my family and my friends? And I couldn't figure out how to capture it because it was a feeling, it was a communal experience. Yeah,
Mhm.
seeing people so freely dance on raves and during Grateful Dead concerts and Renaissance Fair too. It was just so much expansiveness at the time. And it took me a
Yeah.
long time to even understand what that meant and how that changed me. And of course, eventually that led to the whole Burning Man community that
Right.
we're both
Right.
familiar with. And there's such beauty in open-minded communities where we get to express our authenticity
Mhm.
without fear of judgment.
Right. And we get to really explore and stretch ourselves. And Burning Man's a wonderful example if we want to tie in awakenings, but also integration. I mean, personally, I say that Burning Man is compressive and expansive because it just crushes you. And some of it's
Hmm.
like the desert challenges of the environment, but it's so expansive. And so sometimes what happens is that people at first love the self that they discover in that space. And if you think that you can only be that person 1 week out of the year or under the influence of different things, then that's also a crushing experience because that means it's something you only get when you set up a certain environment.
Yeah.
But the other idea is let's say you do have a very expansive experience through Burning Man or certainly through psychedelic opportunities. How can you then have some touch points of the experience? Maybe you journal a little bit or you write a few things down, what you think the message is in that moment. And then you continue setting aside some time afterwards to turn inward and have a conversation with yourself. Like, what did that experience feel like? Let's say it's 2 weeks post Burning Man, and you might call it a thought experiment or a daydream or a vision. There's a lot of different words for these things where you mentally take yourself back, like float back is kind of a mental health word in EMDR work. You float back into an experience and you try to activate it in your body. We can think about something negative and bring up sad feelings, or we can think about something positive and bring up expansive feeling. So when
Hmm.
you touch point back into an experience and like invite it to come back into your body, the consciousness and the mental pathways there can repopulate and reform, and that strengthens it. And so every time you go back to a thing and you let yourself, oh yeah, what did it feel like to feel really expansive, or making time and space after the highlight experience to go back and return to that and then just let it sit. Or I even think of it like cooking. Like when you make a cake, right? You bring all the ingredients together, but then you got to put it in the oven and let it cook for a little while. So you don't necessarily
Hmm.
have to do anything to it, but you just want to give space for it to cook. And I think we're the same way when we're teaching our psyche how to create a new normal of whatever this expanded state was, whatever it meant to you, and whatever you want to take away
Mm.
from it.
Yeah, I really like that metaphor of the cooking for integration. Yeah, there's all these experiences that happen, and then there's a review. There's a bringing back of what was the highlights and the
Mm-hmm.
expansive parts of that, and how can I bring more of that in rather than falling back into old patterns or even feeling sorry for myself for no longer being in that expansive state.
Sure, right.
Which I hear that a lot from people who go to ayahuasca ceremonies, how the plant medicine comes from the Amazon jungle. And those were people that took this medicine together.
Mm-hmm.
And then they went through the experience together. And then they stayed together in the same tribe and integrated together.
Right.
Versus here in this culture, when this medicine makes it here, it can be that people get dropped into these beautiful, expansive containers. They have these heart and mind opening
Mm-hmm.
experiences. And then they go straight back to their jobs, to their nuclear families, and they no longer have that support that's
Mm-hmm.
absolutely necessary, which is also that integration. And they can really throw people off.
It really can. Historically, vision quest or mushroom ceremonies, they were, maybe it was done by the uncle to the nephew, or the rites of passage that all happened within the tribe. And now the fact that we have opportunities, like even in Oregon, there's psilocybin support, there's MDMA support, but the ability to stay in that thread of, you said, community makes a big difference. I will say that sometimes when people really get to venture in their psyche, there is sometimes an element when people use the phrase, I feel like I left my body. And so sometimes that's one of the parts of integration that is important. 'Cause sometimes people can get a little scared or rattled. Like
Hmm.
leaving the body, somehow on the return, things can get a little scary. And so integration's not always because everything was great. Sometimes integration involves things were kind of scary or I feel discombobulated
Yeah.
because we can go pretty far in those journeys.
Yeah, and I'm glad you're talking to that because definitely difficult things can come up, and
Mhm.
then just shoving them away is not necessarily going to help. That might just bury the trauma and then make things even worse down the road. So yeah, really having that support, and
Mhm.
Oregon is on the forefront of that. Hopefully, there's going to be enough resources for people to have
Mhm.
the ability to work with professionals to help integrate that until we change into a society where it's all held within the container of the community that we live within.
Yeah, right. There's a lot of paths right now trying to help people get access to those plant medicines that can be a supportive part of sensing and actually getting to feel what your philosophy is. It's one thing to read a bunch of books and think, okay, I believe we're connected, but to feel like we're all connected, that takes it to another level.
Hmm. And I know you do some of that work as a psychotherapist, working with people, helping them integrate. So I do want to give you a chance to share with our audience how they can find you and if you have any offerings.
Oh, sure. The easiest way to find me is through my website. It is mckennacounseling.com. And I do a consult with people in the beginning to see what their goals are. In general, if I were to say real quick, I do a lot of work in the field of eating disorders, chronic illness,
Mhm.
anxiety, and trauma. And I have a master's degree in nutrition. The short version is I like to work with people who are tired of therapy and want to stop talking about things, but want to actually process and heal through their
Mm.
bodies and let go of pain and trauma in their bodies.
That's beautiful. And do you have a website or how can people find you?
Yeah, the easiest way is my website, mckennacounseling.com. So my last name's, I'm Katie McKenna, and so mckennacounseling.com.
Fantastic. And I will make sure to put the link to that in the show notes. Before we end, and actually, even before I'm going to get to the very last question, I would still like to learn a little bit more about your awakening experience. And specifically, if you look at your life
Mhm.
before and
Yeah.
after, what is the big shift that you're wanting to share with this audience?
I think honestly, the biggest shift was understanding that there are people out there that exist that weren't like my family.
Hmm.
My family is, they're wonderful people, but the way they live, I didn't feel like I belonged. I felt like the outsider. So finding a tribe and community of people who think differently and are seeking open-mindedness and evolution, understanding that I didn't have to fit my family, I could find other people and that other people exist. That's really what did a lot for me.
Hmm. Yeah, that difference between family and soul family, and knowing
Right.
that we don't need to fit into a cookie cutter version of how we were brought up to
Mm-hmm.
think, but that we
Mm-hmm.
actually have the potential to find our own people that will give us the opportunity to live and express ourselves the way that it feels most aligned.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I can absolutely relate to that as well. And yeah, I was just in Switzerland for a month and I love it there. But every time I come back here to the Pacific Northwest, my soul just knows that I'm supposed to be here. A lot of people
Mm-hmm.
ask me with all the political things that are happening, like, why don't you move back? I can't explain it other than I just know I'm supposed to be here in the Salish Sea and that's my home. And until that changes, I'm going to stay here.
You're hearing your intuition and your guidance and that sense of self and that knowledge of this is where I need to be. That's such a powerful experience.
It really is.
Mm.
So we are coming to the end of this conversation, which I'm so grateful we had that, Katie. Yeah, I didn't really know you very well. I knew Titus much better than you, and I'm just really grateful that we have this opportunity. And I hope we get to talk a lot more off and
I would
maybe
love that.
on the
Yeah.
podcast again in the future. If you could go back in time and give a message to a younger version
Oh
of you,
gosh.
what would you tell her?
I would say you're going to find your way.
Hmm.
As a younger person, carried a lot of pain, and to be able to give that guidance of just keep at it, it's going to work out, and not in that rosy posy way, but just you're going to find yourself and you're going to find a path that really, really, really suits you.
Nice.
Because I do feel like that I'm here now. Mhm.
Beautiful. It sounds absolutely beautiful. So, yeah, thank you so much for being on this show, for sharing all your wisdom, and I wish you well.
Thank you. I just appreciate this conversation and the work that you're doing to help people understand spirituality and awakenings, and tying that in with the psyche is all such just an amazing part of the opportunity we have here. And I appreciate that you're helping people do that.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for tuning into the Wake Up Protocol. If you like what you heard, share this episode with 3 people who need to hear this message. And if you want to go deeper, head to thewakeuprotocol.com and sign up for our email list. That's where we share behind the scenes insights, bonus resources, exclusive invites, and the kind of guidance we only send to our community. And if this is the last thing you hear from us, all we'd like to say is keep going, trust yourself, follow your heart. Until next time, have a safe and happy journey.